The 2000s marked a turning point in television, with some programs going to dark places they'd never gone to before. From police procedurals to iconic cartoons, these episodes of beloved shows weren't afraid to cover tough topics. The American version of The Office helped popularize cringe comedy, particularly through the embarrassing antics of Dunder Mifflin Scranton branch manager Michael Scott. Seemingly unaware of the damage and chaos he leaves in his wake, Michael has nothing to offer but is so desperate to be liked that he routinely makes promises that he can't keep. In what's become the most notorious episode of The Office by far, it's revealed that he once promised college tuition to an entire class of students.
I've made some empty promises in my life, but hands down, that was the most generous.
Scott's Tots sees Michael and Aaron visit the local high school, where the senior class has been anticipating a round of scholarships courtesy of Mr. Scott. After sitting through a song and dance number honoring Michael for his generosity, he must admit to all of their faces that he never accrued the fortune that he anticipated having a decade ago. The kids are crushed, and Michael's hapless graduation gift of laptop batteries only makes it worse. Fewer television episodes are harder to sit through than Scott's Tots. Fans rewatching the series will sometimes skip the episode entirely while making their way through Season 6. The main arc of Season 3 of the scientific police procedural Bones was the tracking and capture of a charismatic, persuasive, and brutal repeat cannibal killer, initially known only as Gormagon. Over time, the team of brilliant forensic anthropologists from the Jeffersonian, led by Dr. Temperance Brennan and FBI liaison Seeley Booth, realized that Gormagon has an apprentice responsible for some of his most horrific acts. Much of the running time of the 2008 episode, The Pain in the Heart, is devoted to setting up nerdy and unlikely Dr. Hodgins as this apprentice. But it can't be that simple. The team discovers that the inside operative is the even more unlikely intern, Zach Addy, a sweet, sensitive genius who is exactly the kind of person Gormagon could manipulate. It's a particularly dark and sad episode of Bones, which is dark enough as it is, considering its propensity to depict rotting human remains. It breaks the procedural format while writing actor Eric Milligan off the show, as Zach is convicted of murder and sentenced to live out his days in a mental health facility. Patients died all the time on the medical dramedy Scrubs. That's just part of life for hospital doctors. The show deftly weaved tragedy with comedy, particularly via fantasy sequence from the mind of young resident Dr. John Dorian. The 2004 episode My Screwup used that storytelling device to tell a devastating story of grief and give viewers a shocking twist ending. The usually unflappable physician in charge, Dr. Perry Cox, is busy planning his son's first birthday party and celebrating his brother-in-law Ben's newly cancer-free status. Before going out to run an errand, Dr. Cox tells JD to run some tests on Ben, but JD would rather tend to the elderly Mr. Taylor.
I already looked at his EKG, newbie, and trust me, he's not gonna die in the next 30 minutes. Now, go!
It seems that Dr. Cox was wrong, as he returns to find out that Mr. Taylor actually did die while he was gone. This sends him into a rage, so he blames JD, takes over his patients, and works for days straight. The episode ends with Dr. Cox and Ben having a conversation about the power of forgiveness. Dr. Cox admits he doesn't want to go to the party, because it isn't a party at all. It's Ben's funeral. Mr. Taylor hadn't been the one who died. Ben was. The typically tough and unemotional Dr. Cox crumbles, physically and emotionally. Comedians Trey Parker and Matt Stone struck Colorado mountain gold with South Park, gaining a reputation for having one of the raunchiest shows around. While elementary schooler Eric Cartman has engaged in all sorts of problematic antics, none of his exploits come close to his actions in the 2001 episode Scott Tenorman Must Die. After local 9th grader Scott Tenorman swindles Cartman out of $10, Cartman decides to take revenge. He writes Scott's favorite band, Radiohead, asking them to come to town, convincing them to make the trip by lying about Scott dying of cancer. Cartman tells his friends about the plan. He's going to train a starving pony to bite off Scott's genitals, and he'll embarrass himself by crying in front of Radiohead. The kids warn Scott, who sends his parents to deal with the pony. Cartman reveals all at the South Park Chili Con Carnival. He knew his friends would tell Scott, and that Scott would send his parents to the pony farm, where he knew Farmer Jenkins would shoot and kill the trespassers on sight. The chili that Scott's chowing down on, it's made out of his own parents, whose bodies Cartman chopped up. Scott is destroyed emotionally, with Radiohead watching as Cartman celebrates his victory.
Oh, the tears of unfathomable sadness. Yummy, yummy, you guys.
CBS enjoyed 15 years of high ratings for Criminal Minds, as millions found it satisfying to watch genius detectives and profilers stop some of the most despicable and frightening killers and kidnappers on television. The good guys usually won on Criminal Minds, but the happy ending of catching serial murdering villains couldn't overcome the horrific imagery and story conjured by the two-part Season 4 ender in 2009, To Hell, followed by And Back. When numerous people living on the edge of society in Detroit begin to disappear, the Behavioral Analysis Unit takes the case. When they finally find their culprit, it's a sadder, more complex, and far more gruesome situation than the team could have imagined, or network TV viewers could have expected. Developmentally disabled adult Lucas Turner had paralyzed his brother Mason when he wanted to sell their family pig farm. Lucas wound up caring for his brother while also venturing out to steal medical supplies and kidnap people. The victims were used to perform deadly rudimentary stem cell removal procedures, all under Mason's orders. As for the spent bodies of the disappeared, Lucas fed those to the pigs. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia has all the bones of a traditional sitcom, but there's nothing traditional about the gang. Dennis, Dee, Mac, Charlie, and Frank have become television legends thanks to their schemes, which usually involve deception, debasement, and even death. The 2007 episode, Mac is a Serial Killer, has all three of those things. When Mac shows up wearing the same clothes he wore the previous day with scratches on his neck, Frank thinks he might be the serial killer that's on the loose.
Oh, if I prove that he is guilty, I am gonna torture the shit out of him.
Mac is no killer, but he does have a secret. He's dating a trans woman, and he doesn't want to tell his friends yet. Dennis and Dee want to find the real killer. So to get into the proper mindset, they stalk the waitress with tools stolen from a hardware store manned by Dee's neighbor, Gary. Dennis and Dee meet back up with Frank to call Mac, luring him into Gary's apartment. When Frank threatens to kill Mac with a chainsaw, Mac finally reveals the truth. So if Mac isn't the killer, who is? That's quickly revealed when Charlie opens Gary's fridge looking for beer and finds multiple severed heads instead. Gary comes home and Frank turns on the chainsaw as the episode concludes, implying that the gang murders the murderer. Patients experiencing medical trauma frequently and heartbreakingly died on ER, with the series showing the profound impact of such experiences on medical professionals. The two-part saga from 2000, Be Still My Heart and All in the Family, are the best ER episodes ever, at least according to IMDb users. They offer some of the series' most harrowing medical drama, while also making it personal for the doctors, overwhelmingly and tragically so. It's not a lovely Valentine's Day in the ER, as multiple doctors try and fail to save the lives of a couple involved in a car accident while the victim's kids look on. Another team treats a sick dog, while the sometimes romantically entangled physicians Carter and Knight both tend to Paul, a man with serious mental health issues. Dr. Carter lashes out at Knight and storms off after a disagreement, so he's not present when Paul suffers an episode, finds a knife, and uses it to stab Dr. Knight. Carter discovers his dying colleague on the floor of the exam room after Paul stabs him too, and the pair stare at each other as they drift into unconsciousness. Despite the best efforts of the trauma response team, Dr. Knight dies from internal injuries suffered in the stabbing. Dr. Carter survives, a broken man after the death of his colleague and potential love. From episode 1, it was clear that Breaking Bad was going to be a gloomy affair. The series tracked the descent of Walter White, a scientist turned chemistry teacher who becomes a cutthroat New Mexico methamphetamine dealer in order to fund his cancer treatments and provide for his family after his death. Season 2's penultimate episode, Phoenix, represents a particularly bleak turning point in Walt's moral downfall. Walt is resentful over missing his daughter's birth because his partner Jesse was too high on heroin to handle a major meth sale. He refuses to hand over his accomplice's cut of the profits, so Jesse's girlfriend, Jane, concocts a blackmail scheme to get the money.
Do right by Jesse tonight, or I will burn you to the ground.
Walt decides to hand over the cash, but only to Jesse. When he decides to go back to Jesse's apartment later to talk to him, Walt finds him and Jane passed out from the effects of heroin. Walt tries to rouse his partner, which makes Jane shift onto her back. It's not long before she vomits and begins to choke. While Walt is more than capable of saving Jane's life, he chooses to watch her die instead. Dexter presented an audacious, gruesome, and psychologically taxing spin on the familiar TV genre of cop versus killer. Dexter Morgan, a blood splatter analyst for the Miami Police Department, harbors an insatiable urge to kill, so he rationalizes his serial murdering by only targeting bad people, like other serial killers. While Dexter was never family viewing, some fans thought that the season 4 finale, The Getaway, still went a bit too far. Dexter spends most of the season getting close to Arthur Mitchell, a church-going family man who has a double life as the Trinity Killer. Arthur figures out Dexter is also a murderer, but Dexter manages to make his move and take out his rival with a hammer. Thinking his bloodlust is permanently satiated, Dexter looks forward to a quiet, murder-free life with his family. He returns home and finds his wife, Rita, dead for hours by Arthur's hand in a bathtub full of her own blood. His young son Harrison sits traumatized on the bathroom floor, covered in his mother's blood, mirroring Dexter's earliest memory of his mother's murder. Across its original 13-season run, King of the Hill consistently told low-key, amusing, realistic stories about Texan propane salesman Hank Hill's attempts to relate to his goofy son Bobby and make sense of the rapidly changing world. Writers deviated from the form very occasionally, never more dramatically than with the surreal and macabre 2003 episode Pigmalion. Luann attends a class at the Learning Annex and meets Trip Larson, a pork processing tycoon. He offers Luann a job and instantly develops an unhealthy fixation with her. He dictates how Luann dresses and wears her hair, and moves her into his home with no warning. Peggy vocally opposes the relationship, and she receives a headless pig on her doorstep for doing so. Trip serves Luann drugged milk and dyes her hair red in an attempt to transform her into a woman from a Larson Pork Products poster that he idealized since childhood. Rejecting a marriage proposal from Trip while he's dressed in a pig costume at a Halloween party, Luann flees into a slaughterhouse and gets caught on a conveyor belt. As she's about to be turned into sausage, Trip joins her and welcomes death, only for Peggy to find them at the last minute. She saves Luann, while Trip gets impaled on a spike and killed.
And now, he's in a better place.
Honey, Trip had a mental breakdown and is now a sausage. That's not a better place.
By the end of Season 5, House had settled into a formula that made it a compelling, heavily watched medical procedural drama. Each episode, a couple of patients would check into the Princeton Plainsboro Teaching Hospital with a mystery ailment, and Dr. House would crudely insult his assistant diagnosticians until they all identified and treated the disease. That all still happens in the 2009 episode Simple Explanation, as the medical team copes with a patient who recovers from a terminal illness just as his wife and caretaker seem to be at death's door. A member of the staff unexpectedly dies. Dr. Lawrence Kuttner, usually a cheery, optimistic, and kind individual, is discovered to have died by suicide. The other doctors grieve, totally unable to cope with the loss because it just doesn't make sense to them. House, deep in denial, thinks Dr. Kuttner must have been murdered, but alas, there is no simple explanation for suicide. The episode is partly so dark because it unexpectedly delves into the personal life of one of its supporting characters, and doesn't offer up any easy answers in the wake of a devastating loss.